All right, everybody, go ahead and start filtering back in. Hope everyone had a chance to get a little water, freshen up, take a break between segments of our class. We are going to try to recommit ourselves to doing this more often whenever we can. Sometimes we have 3 buckets of lecturers in the day, which is a little bit tricky to find the right time to give you all a break, but we do know it's helpful for a little bit of Zoom fatigue. Are there any other just kind of quick burning questions coming out of Tori's presentation? If we want, we can tackle them as a class, and if not, we'll dive into this next deck where we're going to take you through some details of the overall Lunar-Class launch ecosystem. Tori did a really nice job of introducing this from the perspective of ULA, which makes sense, right? That's where he's coming from. But we also want you to understand some of the other players involved, some of the history of the lunar missions that have been planned, or the lunar campaigns that have been planned previously, like Constellation, the role of SLS, and where NASA comes into all of this. And then, of course, at the end, we'll also touch on Blue Origin and SpaceX, which are another of the 2 big elephants in the room when it comes to commercial Lunar-Class launch. So with that, any other quick questions from Tori's segment, or should we go ahead and just get started here with this deck? Okay. Great. Mehak, can you take us away? And credit to Mehak for developing this slide deck. And Jeff and I are going to speak to it a little bit as we want to add some color to the different topics.
Great, yeah. I just wanted to take us through some of the history, and Jeff and Ariel will kind of add some of the details about some of these missions and programs. But just starting with obviously the Apollo program mission architecture, I think it's really important for us to understand like where all of the first moon missions came from. So obviously everybody's familiar with the Saturn V, this really heavy lift class launch vehicle. It's composed of 5 F1 engines on the first stage and a hydrogen oxygen engine on the upper stages. And it was kind of this intermediate sized rocket. And the reason that they wanted to develop something that was intermediate, not super heavy lift, was that they had chosen this particular mission architecture, which I'll take you through in the next couple of slides. But the important thing also to understand here is that over its operational life, it actually improved in capabilities. So with increasing iterations and increasing demands from the Apollo missions, including the astronauts wanting more time on the lunar surface, so therefore more materials, also including new mission architectures like adding a roving vehicle, going to different parts of the moon. So there were different operational requirements that evolved over the program's lifetime. So when it started, the performance was at 36 metric tons to get to the moon, but at the end in Apollo 17, they had reached 52 metric tons. So it was like a considerable increase in terms of performance. So the 3 mission modes that were being considered for the Apollo mission, this is one of them, the direct flight mission mode. So basically in this, they would think that they were going to send a spacecraft to soft land on the moon with enough propellant to return to the Earth. And that would require a booster large enough to carry and lift the fuel necessary to leave Earth's orbit, break in the moon's gravity, leave the moon's gravity, and then break in Earth's gravity. So when they did an initial study for this performance, they found that it would require a launch vehicle with liftoff thrust of 53 million pounds. So that's compared to Saturn V, which is 34.5 million newtons, and 8 F1 engines. So if you saw that Saturn V had 5. So that was a really, really different level of performance compared to what they were ultimately able to achieve with the Saturn V. And the cost, this was completely cost prohibitive for the program objectives. The other option, which was actually really seriously considered, this was the primary mode that people were considering before the final mode was considered, was the Earth Orbit Rendezvous. So in this, the launch elements would be launched separately. So there would be 2 launches. They would rendezvous and dock in Earth orbit, assemble, fuel, and detach a lunar mission vehicle. So that would require 2 launches, joining them in orbit, pumping fuel from one to the other, and then realigning and lifting off that rocket to the moon. In this way, there was actually more capability to have larger payloads. But obviously, this is really technically challenging, right, to do rendezvous and docking in Earth orbit. But also, this was also being considered in terms of like programmatic considerations, because a lot of the Apollo mission leaders wanted to think about developing a space station in low Earth orbit. So this was kind of like the early stages of, okay, what if we've started doing and staging these kinds of architectures in low Earth orbit and then going on to the moon? But ultimately, what was chosen was the Lunar Orbit Rendezvous. So this is considered riskier in some ways, but the idea was to park the Earth return propulsion portion of the spacecraft in orbit around the moon. So if you have seen any movies about Apollo, right, you always see the command service module going around the moon. And the idea is that the lander leaves the mothership in lunar orbit to descend to the moon's surface. Upon ascent to lunar orbit, it links up with the mothership. Astronauts transfer to the command module and then return to Earth for reentry and landing. In this way, there's actually less weight injected towards the moon, and one spacecraft could be designed for lunar landing and takeoff, while the other could be designed specifically for flying to and from the moon and for reentry for Earth and landing. So not only was this actually helping, right, in terms of the amount of weight consideration, but also it allowed for increased work. So there was 2 spacecraft that need to be designed that allowed for 2 different contractors, prime contractors, to be considered for the project, which is also a big consideration during the Apollo missions. Other benefits, it was easier in the case of a malfunction to return from Earth orbit rather than going straight to the moon and then having to eject if necessary. And then there was the operational flexibility that came with this. In the case of a delay, if you were parked in Earth orbit first, then you had time to pick up the slack before you went on to the lunar orbit. So basically, if there was a delay, then they would park less time in Earth orbit, and then they would have the ability to go on to the moon. Then also, the restart of the 3rd stage in parking orbit for translunar injection would take place at almost the same time of the day, regardless of launch delays. So that's operational flexibility, just benefits from the payload capability. And then I just want to take us through just understanding how many, oh, sorry, go ahead. Yeah, Jeff.
Let me just add one
Great.
other consideration, and that was the time consideration. President Kennedy said we need to do this before the end of the decade. And one of the points that was made in considering the Lunar Orbit Rendezvous, as you said, it had 2 separate manufacturers entirely, and therefore the work could be split, and that gave a better chance. And that was actually mentioned in the decision-making process, that that gave them a better chance of being able to meet the time deadline.
One thing that we also want to emphasize by showing you guys these different options, so Mehak is showing you the historical considerations that went into whether they were going to do an Earth orbit rendezvous or whether they were going to do a direct mission. These are different options, like what Tori Bruno mentioned with the near rectilinear halo orbit, that can be considered when you're doing your mission concepts and weighed against cost and feasibility and time and all of these different dimensions. We want you all to also be thinking about the pros and cons of your approach to getting to orbit and then to the surface. So it's a nice thing to keep in mind. Tori had also mentioned, just when Mehak brings up the Saturn V here, Tori had mentioned the importance of maintaining continuity of expertise and knowledge for production of boosters and production of the actual alloys and everything for the the creation of the rocket hardware. There are a number of urban stories, and I'm sure Jeff knows a little bit more about this than I do, about elements of our knowledge for the production of the Saturn V that were lost over time or harder to find in archives. And so it is an important point that Tori makes about the continuity of knowledge and expertise recording for our ability to actually produce rockets and traditional capability at that scale.
Yeah, on that note, I was reading about basically the huge push after they proposed Constellation to bring back all of the archived knowledge from Apollo. And they found that actually Pink Floyd had access to all these videos of Apollo 11 landing that were taken from NASA and never given back. So there were somebody had just sent Pink Floyd these videos, and they realized that they had the only copy. So that was just there was a lot of problems with knowledge management coming out of the Apollo era. Everything was on paper and in these files, and when they were trying to build up the expertise when they decided to go back to the moon and build a new heavy lift launch vehicle right after the space shuttle program, then that was a huge undertaking for NASA. So, and I also think that it's worth mentioning that Apollo is not only this amazing technical feat, but also this program management. And then, as Jeff was saying, right, political feat, just trying to get all these different pieces together and the funding involved across, different NASA, standing up different NASA centers for over 400,000 people working on this program. So, yeah, so then going on to the Apollo mission campaign, just showing the kind of frequency with which we were having Apollo missions going to the moon, I think is also really amazing. And the idea here is also the responsiveness, right, of the launch vehicle and the ability to send people and cargo into space. And this was kind of the precursor to then Space Shuttle was really the holy grail of let's have reusable access, frequent launch access to orbit. And so I think this is just an interesting thing to note is how many missions there were. There were also a few missions I know that were canceled at the end that were slated for launch that just after the program started dying down and would have less congressional support, weren't able to be flown. All right. Any other thoughts on the Apollo program before we move on? Great. Oh.
I will say there were some amazing plans for had the Apollo program continued.
Yeah.
They were planning to attach possibly a nuclear power source to the rover so that they'd be able to continue to use the rover in an unmanned way. There were plans for going to having a mission to the far side of the moon. I mean, there were all sorts of things which we could have done. We had the capability, the technology had been developed, and I always look at it, as amazing as it was to get to the moon with Apollo, it was also amazing how fast we threw it all away. And as Tori said, we still haven't gone back 50 years later.
Yeah, there's a quote from, I feel like one of the last Apollo astronauts that said, if I don't see a lunar orbiting space station in the next decade, then this will have been for naught. So that's, yeah, pretty.
Yeah, I wouldn't quite agree with that. I mean,
yeah.
It is clear when you study the history of the Apollo program, it was never designed to be a sustainable program. And that's a critical thing when we look ahead. There's certain things that you require for sustainability, one of which is affordability. And it was decided that, it wasn't that we couldn't have afforded it if we wanted to, because we paid for the Vietnam War, we paid for the Great Society program, but the Nixon administration decided that that was it for Apollo, and so that was the end.
Yeah, and historians in even some of our professors in MIT Aeroastro, like David Mendel, have looked at this history through Apollo and compared it to why did we have quicker, faster success with commercial aviation, for example, in the 1940s and 50s. And part of it is because it was no longer just the US government as the main anchor partner keeping commercial aviation going. There were many different commercial companies that got involved and built an active ecosystem. And I think what gives some of us hope that this moment is going to be different and we're not going to lose our momentum about going back to the moon again like happened after Apollo is because we're beginning to see a richer ecosystem of these other commercial and economic players that can hopefully make spaceflight beyond LEO more robust in the same way that we over time saw a building up of the commercial aviation industry.
Well, Ariel, I mean, you use the word commercial, and that's the big difference. If there's money to be made, then the critical role of the government is reduced. So for commercial aviation, yes, the government helped out in the early days developing military aviation and then subsidizing airmail flights while the commercial airline companies sort of built up. And so that's, again, what Tori was talking about, the government being an incubator, but ultimately it will depend on whether or not there's money to be made on the moon, whether all of these, commercial dreams actually happen. And, just making water on the moon may not be enough because, the only people who are going to use that water are people doing space missions. And is there enough, are there enough of those to justify the expense? We'll find out. I mean, we still have no idea what the form of the water is, how hard it will be to dig it out, what will be the cost of mining it. So there's a lot of things that need to be determined before you can really say that something is going to be commercially viable. But that's the bottom line. Can people make money on the moon?
Exactly. And Jeff brings up a really nice point for the class that is important to take Tori's presentation in context, right? So he's picturing, painting this very rosy picture of being able to extract this water, convert it into propellant, get an ecosystem going. But Jeff's absolutely right. And if we think back to the class that we had last week or the week before, with Brent and Ollie and Carissa talking about it, is still very much an open question as to whether the business cases will close for commercial activity around the moon. Great. All right, Mehak, let's go into constellation.
Yeah, I would love to take Jeff's approach here also to help us also bridge the gap between what happened in between Apollo and like the Constellation program, right? So NASA then got tied up developing the space shuttle program and starting to build out the International Space Station. So at this point, which was, you know, we were still in the midst of developing the International Space Station, but President Bush had announced that we were going to retire the space shuttle. So the Constellation program emerged out of this kind of void where, you know, we were going to be left without this launch capability, this native launch capability. So there was a proposal for 2 shuttle-derived launch systems. And I think Jeff might have many more things to say on this slide about how we got to the Ares 5 and the Ares 1.
Sure, if you want me to start. First of all, remember that President Bush, and this is George W. in 2004. So the Columbia disaster was 2003, and after the Columbia Accident Investigation Board, they basically, NASA had to figure out what we were going to do. You know, at that time, before Columbia, people were talking about keeping the shuttle going for another 25 years, sort of, you know, the DC-3 was an airplane analogy. But, you know, the realization that it was expensive to operate and was becoming more and more risky as it got older. So when George W. Bush gave that talk in January of 2004 and announced that, yes, after the space station is fully assembled, we will retire the shuttle, which at that time was supposed to be 2010. And we're going to go back to the moon. We're going to build a new series of rockets. And when the class started, we had a design class going in February, Ed Crawley and I. And you know, when we went to that first class meeting, it was electric because the students, you know, like all of you now, looked at this and saying, you know, this is going to be our Apollo. You know, they looked at us and said, yeah, you guys lived through the Apollo program. I was a graduate student during Apollo, and but you know, we haven't had anything like that, and now we're going to have it. So as far as one of the recommendations that came out of well, it actually went all the way back to Challenger disaster, the idea that we were going to require that humans fly on every flight, even when you're just delivering cargo to orbit. And so the watchword back then was, let's separate human launch from cargo launch. And that's why you end up here with the Ares 1 and the Ares 5. The Ares 5 was, you know, a big heavy lift rocket. How are we going to launch people? Well, at the time, when you think about it, when we finally retired the shuttle, we had 135 flights. We had, you know, already over 100 flights at the time of Columbia. So that's over 200 missions for the solid rocket boosters with only one failure. And actually, after Challenger, the boosters were redesigned. And so at that point, we had no failures. The solid boosters for the shuttle program were far and away the most reliable rocket system that had ever been developed. And so why not put humans on top of that? Actually, I remember, and by the way, it was supposed to be just by using the solids that we had used for the shuttle, which were 4-segment boosters, we could avoid a very lengthy and expensive revalidation process. Unfortunately, when they started then getting into the design as the Constellation program progressed, They were trying to build in all sorts of redundancy, like the shuttle had into Orion, and it was much too heavy, and so they started cutting out redundancy. But no matter what they did, you couldn't launch it with a 4-stage solid booster, and that's why you say here a 5-segment booster, which is basically a new rocket. And so that was part of the justification for from the cost went away. And the second thing that they found, and this is something I can attest to, the first 2 minutes of a shuttle flight, there's unbelievable vibration and noise. And it comes basically from the solids, because you have the big, the tube coming down the middle, and there's a tremendous amount of turbulence inside there. And so I was thinking to myself, we were sitting on the shuttle, which was attached to those solids. And so some of the vibration was damped by the attachment mechanism. What would it be like to actually sit on top of one of those things? I mean, it would be safe. And when they actually started doing the tests, simulating, they found there was so much vibration that the crew could not even read the computer screens. They came up with an interesting solution. As you're going up and down with a certain frequency and bouncing around, they would shut off the computer screen while you were moving. And when you got sort of up to the top of that vibration, they would light up the computer screen, and so you could actually then read it. To me, that was a realization, hey, what's wrong with this picture? In any case, the other thing that happened when President Bush announced the Constellation program, he said there's going to be an increase in NASA's budget to make this possible. Well, that never happened. And so I know quite well the guy who was the program manager for Constellation. He said he was given less than 10% reserves every year. And that's just for if you've studied systems engineering, you ought to have at least a 30% reserve in the early stages of a project like that. So they continually had problems which had to be solved, typical for a new program. But instead of being able to solve them in reasonable time, because they didn't have the reserves in the budget, things got pushed to the right further and further. And so that increases the run out cost. And it could have been possible to fix it. I've spoken to numerous people, but what happened was when the Obama administration took over, they said, no, this is too much. And also nobody knows still who actually gave Obama the idea that when he finally said down at his visit to KSC, oh, the moon, been there, done there, that we got to go somewhere else. And that was basically the end. So I'll turn it back to you now, Mehak.
I mean, yeah, maybe you can talk a little bit more too about like this moon to Mars strategy, right? The idea of NASA's domain.
Well, at that point, the moon literally became a 4-letter word at NASA. You were not allowed to talk about going to the surface of the moon. And so the people at NASA doing the best that they could, with the hope that someday that policy would change, I think that was ultimately the origin of the Gateway. The Gateway was originally designed as a stop-off point for going to Mars. With a lot of criticism that you really don't need to do this to go to Mars. But it was the only thing that we could do. And I think some farsighted people at NASA, Bill Gerstenmaier, who was head of the Human Spaceflight Division at the time, was trying within the limits of not being able to actually talk about lunar surface exploration, create an infrastructure related to Mars, but that hopefully ultimately could be used one day for lunar surface exploration, which is what they're trying to do with the Gateway now. Whether you really need a gateway for human surface exploration is still a question. Clearly, if you're going to have a lot of reusable elements, eventually you're going to want some sort of a facility in orbit around the moon. whether we need to build the gateway before we go to the surface of the moon for the first time, that's another question. But the train has left the station and we're building it, and so. But there's already been talk at NASA. Are we really going to need to use the gateway for the very first trips to the surface of the moon? And then, we're still talking about that. So we'll see. But yeah, what they said was, we're not going to the moon, but there are all these near Earth asteroid objects that Tori talked about, where the delta V is on the same order or even less than going to the moon. So why don't we go to an asteroid? And that will be good practice for going to Mars. Well, when they actually looked at, first of all, the frequency with which these near Earth objects pass by the Earth, they don't come by, every week or every month. And the second thing is that if you miss the launch window, they're gone. And because they come and go, the idea of building any sort of a permanent sustainable structure on a near Earth object that is only going to be near the Earth for a short time is problematic. In the end, they decided, no, we really can't go to an asteroid. So why don't we bring an asteroid back to us? And that was, many people spent a lot of time working on this asteroid recovery mission, ARM. And the idea was they were going to send a robotic mission to an asteroid, near Earth asteroid, chop off a small piece of it, bring it back, put it in lunar orbit. This would be something about the size of a spacecraft, a capsule. And then we can send asteroids to quote unquote explore this piece of an asteroid. I mean, give me a break. Luckily, that people finally woke up and no, this doesn't make sense. And so finally, we are going to go back to the moon, which is where we should have been going all along. I forget which the author was who said that, if God had meant humanity to be a spacefaring species, he would have given us a nice object like the moon, or she, whatever God is, but the point is the moon is a great place. You can get there every month. It's only a few days away, and so on and so forth. And it has resources. So now, Mehak, I'll turn it back to you.
Yes, but before you turn it back to me, I'm turning it back to you, because I think the one missing piece we have here is how we got the Space Launch System. So it was a great.
Yes. So now we get into, whenever you're talking about billion-dollar expenditures of public money, politics is going to get involved. The Marshall Space Flight Center was heavily involved in developing the rockets for Constellation, including the big Ares 5 super rocket. And of course, the big aerospace companies were heavily invested in developing Orion and the Gateway. And so when the Obama administration announced that the Constellation program is being canceled, the senators from Alabama, Texas, and so on said, not so fast, not so fast. We may not be going to the moon, but we still, if you're going to do all this deep space exploration, we still need a big booster. And so the Senate actually came up with requirements on NASA, performance requirements for the booster, which led to the acronym of the SLS, which of course is supposed to mean Space Launch System, but it was often referred to as the Senate Launch System. It was a very weird situation where you literally had Senate staffers setting technical specifications for a launch system. But that's basically why the SLS looks very similar to the original Ares 5 concept. The one difference being is that the separation of humans and cargo was dropped. And so humans will now be riding on top of the SLS with the Orion capsule. So Orion was held over from Constellation, and the Ares 5 morphing into the SLS were holdovers really for, and we should say that when these decisions were made, nowadays a lot of people say, well, why not use SpaceX? They're developing big, heavy boosters. But this was early days for SpaceX when these decisions were made back around 2010. And Elon Musk was having trouble. I don't remember when they had the first successful Falcon 1 launch, but it took 4 tries before they could get even their small rocket into orbit, and people were just not willing to place the future of the American space program in the hands of a as yet unproven commercial company. And Blue Origin at the time was completely under wraps. Nobody even knew what they were doing. We get students coming back from an internship at Blue Origin, and when I asked them what they did for the summer, sorry, I signed a non-disclosure agreement. I can't even tell you. So the idea of NASA utilizing commercial launch facilities was really not in the game back when that decision was made. Is that enough?
Yes, that's great, because that takes me to exactly. So in the midst of everything that's happening, it's important to note that as NASA was investing in the Constellation program in what ultimately became the SLS and going back to the moon with this huge architecture, at the same time, the Obama administration had invested a lot of money in this commercial crew and cargo program, right? So they had set up these service contracts with companies like SpaceX, a few companies that are now just defunct, like Rocket Plane Kistler and other people who had won some contracts in the early days to resupply to the International Space Station cargo, and now ultimately last year crew. That was all happening in the background. So there was this steady state kind of upbringing of like this nascent industry. And that's why now there are new ways and modes of getting to the moon. And I think to build on what Jeff was saying also about, NASA's program and mission architecture about, developing the International Space Station and the Gateway program. We've been developing, this theory. I've been working with a professor at Harvard. We've been talking about, why NASA invests in space stations. And the idea for the International Space Station, for example, right, is that now you have this saturation of launch vehicles. There's all these new companies that are coming out of the market, right, that are really interested in capturing part of that commercial launch industry right now and market. And that's why companies like SpaceX can exist. That's why Blue Origin can exist, because they have somewhere to go, which is the International Space Station. Right now, NASA is their primary customer, especially for crew, right? They're the only customer. So when NASA was thinking about moving onto the moon, they knew that they still needed to have this operational capability and some sort of presence in low Earth orbit. And that's why if you look, at like their design reference mission, okay, for example, it's this kind of in between hybrid now of something that's in between an Earth orbit rendezvous and a lunar orbit rendezvous. And the reason that exists is because NASA wants commercial industry to take over the Earth orbit, have a destination that remains in Earth orbit, so the launch vehicle industry is happy and they have contracts and they have somewhere to go. But then moving on to lunar orbit and creating something that was akin to the International Space Station, which is a gateway, a much pared back. If you look at Gateway, right, it's like much smaller than the International Space Station, fewer partners. Like the idea is it's not going to be permanently crewed the way that the International Space Station is. So there'll be crews that go and come, but already they have, awarded SpaceX a gateway logistics resupply service contract. So in the same way that the International Space Station served as this destination in low Earth orbit, they're hoping to create these new destinations in cislunar space. And as Jeff was mentioning, yes, the idea that it's like necessary to get to the moon with a gateway, that's something that's been heavily contested. And if you see the kind of back and forth that's been playing out in Congress over the funding of Artemis, this is one of the main problems, is that whether or not Gateway is going to be ready for the 2024 crewed launch. And some people argue that Orion needs to be completely redesigned if it's not with the Gateway or something like that. If we use the human landing systems that are being proposed by commercial industry, then it won't be necessary. Some of them require it, right? So there's all these complications about Gateway. But I think it's important to understand that Gateway is not like the first and foremost thing isn't about getting humans to the moon. It's how does NASA create a sustainable program for itself if it's getting out of the International Space Station, which is supposed to come offline in 2024, maybe 2028, and move commercial into the low Earth orbit capability. So these are the first few missions that are being proposed for Artemis. If you guys haven't looked through all of the NASA like Artemis program plans, that's, I mean, I think Tori was referring to them. This is where these kind of charts come from, and they're really, really thorough and interesting to see. And prior to that, if you look at the exploration ESAS, that was the constellation program, right, study. That's how the constellation program, that's also a good resource to look through and see which mission modes they were considering. But this is the Artemis program. Like the idea is that having these robotic precursor missions, proving out SLS, hopefully capability that will be able to service the first few missions. It's supposed to be flying later this year, apparently, which I'm sure if you guys follow the SLS, saga, that's TBD. But otherwise, yeah, like the idea of now this gateway program that will also be serviced by hopefully commercial and SLS launch vehicles. The idea is to create sustainable infrastructures so that the launch vehicle industry can continue to exist and flourish.
And I'll just add a note here that we're seeing the legacy with CLIPS, right? So the CLIPS providers, the commercial lunar payload services providers, and we're going to hear from some of them in the class going forward, like Astrobotic. Tori mentioned the Peregrine mission that ULA has actually been matched now for the launch capability. This focus on NASA buying capability from commercial launch services providers really grew out of this tradition that they proved to be successful from commercial crew and commercial cargo, which was what Mehak was showing you in terms of just the access to resupplying the International Space Station. And that concept has now been moved forward again into this lunar mission architecture and tied in with Gateway and lunar services plans as well.
Yeah, and since we're talking about launch, there's a great paper by Ed Crawley and Sydney Dolan comparing all of the lunar architectures, and I can share that after class as well. So you can take a look at, they've sized out kind of like with Blue Origin compared to ULA, compared to Apollo, and it's really interesting to see what are the capabilities of the launch vehicles that are being proposed. How are we going to get to different access points on the lunar surface? That's a huge consideration, but yes, the other one that's very exciting, under development is Starship. And I think, the interesting thing here to think about SLS versus Starship is that, SLS, I was going to put in a slide, which was kind of sad about like all of the news, the space news headlines about SLS, because it's always like, failed a hot fire, like delayed hot fire, whatever test. Whereas when we see as a spaceship, like they have this rapid, iteration process, which is, they call Elon Musk as like an agile kind of approach. And we were talking to, Charlie Bolden the other day, who was like, if we had an SLS test that blew up on the launch pad, like the whole program would be canceled. We can't have that kind of publicity. So I think it's important to compare and contrast that commercial industry can take these risks. And that's the idea of the types of services, the contracts that they have with NASA, right? Is NASA's trying to push the risk onto commercial industry so that they have the ability to be more risky and take these kinds of, do processes that like they're blowing up rockets every other week, where SLS has to be basically 100% reliable the day that it launches, because it's taxpayer money, because it's heavily scrutinized by Congress. So I think that's an important just distinction between the two programs. They are serving different interests, right? And the other thing with SpaceX, which they're really kind of pushing the boundaries on, is the idea of the economics of launch. So I think this is a slide that just goes over the economics of the reusability with Falcon 9 and what they've kind of been able to achieve here. So, recovering their fairings, which are $5 to $6 million. I also like this picture because it just shows the, how much these boosters go through and how much these spacecraft go through and are being returned to Earth. So yeah, I think the operational capability when Starship is actually reusable, that's what people are really excited about, right? The idea of access to the lunar surface on a reusable, basis, but that also depends heavily on the idea that you can refuel Starship in orbit, which is another thing to consider, right? That Starship is actually only really able to go to the moon if it's refueled in low Earth orbit. So the other thing to note is, yes, this is just a chart that we have of the launch vehicle costs over time, just seeing how much cheaper, but also the increase in payload capability. So obviously Saturn V is this huge, outlier. But over time, you can see this kind of steady decrease in launch vehicle costs over time. We still have a long ways to go before launch is actually affordable. And, we can think about routine access to even to low Earth orbit for crew. Right now, even like a space tourism market is very far off, right? But this is just like to show where, SLS versus Falcon Heavy is kind of stark, right? In terms of the cost savings that now SpaceX is able to achieve. So
one thing I ought to add just with regard to the space shuttle, when they talk about the payload capability, they're referring to just what you could put in the cargo bay, which was up to about 50,000 pounds. For all other rockets, if you are going to send people, you've got all of the crew cabin, the environmental control and life support system, all that stuff, which in the shuttle was not considered part of the payload. So you have to be a little bit careful when you compare shuttle payload capability, particularly for human missions, with all of these other vehicles where all of the human infrastructure would be considered part of the payload, as opposed to the shuttle where it was only the cargo which was considered payload.
Right. And the other benefits to having all these different types of launch vehicles, right, is the idea that you could send cargo, lots of cargo, on really long missions. So maybe it takes Falcon 9 2 years to get to Mars, but that's fine, because if you send it 2 years ahead of any crew, then you've kind of already had your infrastructure set up. And there's also other alternative, propulsions being considered for in-space transportation. So I think that was the nice thing that Tori was showing us with those energy diagrams, is like, once you get out of Earth orbit, how can you think about like alternative ways to transport between?
Yeah, these low energy gravitational boundaries that he referred to, that's a hot topic in celestial orbital design these days. And it is possible, if you're willing to take more time, and perhaps even use electric propulsion for cargo, you could get to the moon with a lot less propellant. You're not going to want to take a 5-month trip to the moon with people, but for cargo, why not? It can wait.
Which in an interesting way is another analog to how we think about supply chain and logistics here on Earth. There's still a massive amount of goods on Earth that travel by slow cargo over barges through ports of entry all around the world. And that is, in some cases, a better economic trade-off than putting it on a FedEx or a DHL or a overnight air carrier. And so I think it makes sense, and we'll hear a little bit more from Ali Dweck about this at the end of the class, about building up these different pieces of a robust ecosystem means having some of these different options for the nature of supply chains, the nature of treating orbits, the time that you accept for your missions to get delivered, if it's cargo versus if it's humans. Mehak, as we prepare to close, because I think we're going to try to let everybody off a couple minutes early today, can you just pull up one of the charts you have, which is the classic, I think it's from Blue Origin, but it's the classic lineup of all of the rockets all together. Did you still have that in the deck? You can find that for a second. I just want the class. If you haven't seen this graphic, it's an interesting lineup of all of these different rockets that we've been talking about today in this Lunar-Class launch session. Most of these rockets are not necessarily Lunar-Class, but it's just interesting, I think, to see what the industry has produced. And as I recall, the one that's missing on the far end is Starship, but it shows most of everything up until Starship. Here we go. So yes, again, full caveat here. This is a chart produced by Blue Origin. Yes, which has a little bit of an agenda to it, of course, which is to show the impact of New Glenn. And what's missing from this is Starship, which would be the SpaceX contender for the lunar missions. But this is just a nice thing to place in context some of the platforms you've heard about today. So great. Any questions before we close class?